He was never afraid to speak, until the final word cost him his life. Charlie Kirk was more than a voice of the American right. He was its spark. On September 10th, 2025, that voice was torn from the stage. But the question now is, why? He inspired millions, loved by many, feared by others, hated by some. His strength came from conviction, but that same fire ignited rage. He warned of an America on the edge, fractured, faltering. He challenged the elite, the media, the opposition. And perhaps, for that very reason, he became a target. Who wanted him silenced, and what were they willing to sacrifice to make it happen? This documentary is not about speculation. It's an investigation, rooted in facts, in testimony, in the final moments that reshaped a movement. We will examine not only who Charlie Kirk was, but who he became, and who stood to gain from the end of his voice. To understand the murder, we must go back to the beginning. His childhood, his convictions, his heroes, and the enemies he made along the way. On September 10th, 2025, in Orem, Utah, 31-year-old Charlie Kirk stood beneath a white canopy, facing a crowd of university students. It was one more stop on what he called the American Comeback Tour, organized by his own Turning Point USA. The setting was familiar, almost ritualistic, a public debate format known as Prove Me Wrong, where he fielded pointed questions from students on some of the most polarizing issues in American life: mass shootings, gender identity, higher education. It was confrontational, charged, often criticized as theatrical, but undeniably effective. That afternoon, surrounded by students, cameras, and controversy, he answered a question with, "Counting or not counting gang violence?" It would be the last sentence anyone would hear from him, before the crack of a gunshot tore through the air. That shot didn't just end a conversation, it ended a life. It silenced a voice that for some had become omnipresent, part firebrand, part mentor, part menace. In that instant, the question was no longer, who was Charlie Kirk, but why would someone do this? Who wanted to silence a voice so divisive, and to what end? Within hours, the American press was calling it what many feared: a political assassination. Not just a tragedy, but a symptom. A violent punctuation in a sentence America keeps repeating. What followed was more than a news cycle. It was a rupture. A moment that exposed the fragility of free speech, the depth of political fracture, and the growing threat of rhetoric turned into weapon. A voice was silenced, but the echoes remained, and they raised deeper questions. Who controls the conversation in modern America? Who decides what can be said and what must be silenced? Are we witnessing the collapse of a civilized space for public discourse, or simply being forced to admit that it never truly existed? Born in Illinois, Charlie Kirk dropped out of college and founded Turning Point USA in 2012. From that point on, he lived to provoke. Over the years, he built a conservative empire focused on college campuses, fueled by social media, podcasts, and confrontation. To his supporters, he was a truth-teller, challenging liberal orthodoxy, exposing what they saw as ideological censorship, inspiring a new generation of conservatives to push back. To his critics, he was a boundary pusher, accused of spreading disinformation, enabling controversial theories, and deliberately stoking conflict with marginalized groups. The event that day followed his typical choreography: high security, a large crowd, Phones recording, live streams broadcasting, a script of pre-fight tension. He'd ask, he'd provoke, the audience would react. Allies and adversaries shared the same digital stage. But that day didn't end in applause. It ended in questions far too big for any stage to contain. This documentary begins not with the sound of a voice, but with its absence, with the silence that followed the shot, and the reverberations that refused to fade. What led to that moment? What kind of culture, what kind of political climate turns a university debate into the site of a killing? How did a voice so powerful to some, so unbearable to others, become something that had to be silenced? What does this say about the state of America, about the systems and tensions that allowed this story to unfold? Throughout this film, we will trace his journey, from his earliest steps to the rise of a media force. We'll examine the networks he built, cultural, political, symbolic. We'll revisit the pivotal moments that shaped his trajectory and ultimately confront the question of what his death, both literal and symbolic, means for the public sphere in the United States today. Because this isn't just a story about Charlie Kirk. It's a story about what happens when a controversial voice is silenced, by force or by fear, in a country that claims to cherish freedom of speech. It's about the razor-thin line between disagreement and disdain, between courage and chaos, between speaking out and being shut down. And now, to understand why that moment exploded, why that voice became intolerable to some, indispensable to others, we must go back to his childhood, to the world that shaped him, to the moments of opportunity and rupture that forged one of the most polarizing figures of his generation. Before the stage, before the fame, before the shot, there was a classroom in Wheeling, Illinois. Charlie Kirk was born on October 14, 1993, in the Chicago suburbs, into a middle-class family steeped in the American ideals of merit, hustle, and self-made success. His father, Robert W. Kirk, was an executive at a construction company. His mother, a devoted counselor. From an early age, Charlie showed signs of the man he would become, unusually articulate, endlessly confident, and gifted with a sharp, persuasive tongue. He wasn't a stellar student in the traditional sense, but he knew how to command attention. The turning point came in high school, when he volunteered for the Senate campaign of Mark Kirk, a moderate Republican. It was his first contact with institutional politics, and he was hooked, not by policy or procedure, but by something deeper: the power to shape narratives, influence minds, and win hearts through persuasion. One moment in particular would set the trajectory. At 18, while attending a conference hosted by the Young America's Foundation, a conservative youth organization, Charlie posed a pointed question about ideological bias in American universities. Among the crowd that day was Bill Montgomery, a retired marketing executive. He approached Charlie after the event. That conversation would change everything. Montgomery became his mentor, financier, and co-founder of what would soon become a national phenomenon, Turning Point USA. This is where we begin to see the blueprint. Charlie had no interest in following the standard academic path. Though accepted to Baylor University, he chose not to enroll. His mission, he believed, lay elsewhere. He wouldn't enter college as a student, but as a disruptor. In his words, American universities had been lost to the left. His mission was to balance the scales. This wasn't education. It was the beginning of a crusade, one he would come to call a culture war. Turning Point USA was born in 2012, built on small donations, grassroots events, and a digital presence that grew by the hour. But the fuel wasn't just ideology, it was outrage. Kirk realized his greatest weapon wasn't public policy, it was symbolism. He cast himself as a resistor to what he labeled the progressive hegemony dominating academia. The playbook was aggressive: expose professors for bias, track left-wing speakers, pressure student governments, and build a conservative youth network that spanned the nation. Within a few years, TPUSA had thousands of student reps, dozens of major events, and a reach far beyond the college quad. Kirk's style was blunt, his posts provocative, his sound bites razor sharp. He was made for the age of the algorithm, but there was something more subtle at work. While many young conservatives aimed for careers in policy or public office, Charlie chose a different battlefield: culture. He understood, better than most on the right, that real power doesn't always reside in law or legislature. It resides in the story, and Charlie Kirk knew how to tell one. Culture was the stage, the war already underway. His weapons, memes, short-form videos, public confrontations, phrases designed to travel fast and hit hard. But beneath the viral flash, he never abandoned the fundamentals: personal responsibility, faith, family, and freedom, all delivered with a digital edge. By 21, he was the youngest speaker ever at the Conservative Political Action Conference, where he was introduced as the future of the conservative movement. He didn't disappoint. With incendiary rhetoric and boyish charisma, he caught the eye of political heavyweights: Donald Trump Jr., Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens. Soon, Turning Point USA was more than a campus group. It was an ideological engine fueling the youth wing of the MAGA revolution. His proximity to the Trump family grew so close that TPUSA began to be seen as an informal incubator for the next generation of populist conservatives. But even in these early days, the fault lines were visible. To his supporters, Kirk was a fearless voice, defying academic conformity. To his critics, he embodied the early stages of something far more dangerous: a radicalization that blurred truth with provocation and fostered a zero-sum hostility toward opposing views. By 2016, during the presidential election he championed with fervor, that polarization would be fully cemented. The young man who once questioned professors was now shaping the minds of thousands. What started as a spark in a lecture hall had become a national movement. But every ascent has its price. The higher he climbed, the more symbolic he became, admired by many, vilified by others. And in an America growing ever more volatile, that kind of duality wasn't just inevitable, it was explosive. Charlie Kirk was standing on the edge of his first great rupture, the moment he would leave behind the promise of youth and step fully into his role as one of the most controversial figures in the new American right. The year is 2016. In the United States, politics has become a permanent state of tension. The presidential race between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump acts as a national accelerant, dividing a country where social media amplifies both fear and hope. For Charlie Kirk, this was more than an election cycle. It was the moment he had been waiting for since founding his organization. At just 23, he emerged as one of the most fervent young defenders of Trump's candidacy. While the Republican establishment hesitated, Kirk dove in headfirst. In speeches, videos, and relentless tweets, he repeated one core message: Trump isn't just a politician, he's a rebellion against the system. He saw in the billionaire's unapologetic bravado the very essence of anti-establishment provocation that had always fueled Turning Point USA. That alignment would become foundational. During the campaign, Kirk crisscrossed campuses, spoke at conferences, posted dozens of times a day. He gained followers and enemies in equal measure. When Trump won in November, Kirk declared, "Today, America chose to restore freedom." But what felt like triumph would soon become transformation. Turning Point, once dismissed as a student activist group, now aimed higher, much higher. Kirk launched new branches: Turning Point Faith to mobilize churches, Turning Point Action for direct political engagement, Turning Point Academy to build alternative curricula. It was no longer just a youth network. It was becoming a full-fledged ideological ecosystem with national reach. Then came 2020. The pandemic would become Kirk's defining pivot. As the world locked down, he pushed back loudly. He questioned restrictions, dismissed lockdowns, criticized vaccines, demanded schools and businesses reopen. In a nation reeling from grief and fear, his words became lightning rods. For many, he was reckless, dangerous. But for a growing base, he was a voice of defiance against what they called medical tyranny. His stance intensified his place within the radical right, but at a cost. That same year, the murder of George Floyd ignited protests across the country. And once again, Kirk didn't hold back. He accused Black Lives Matter of radicalism, claimed systemic racism was a leftist myth, and cited controversial statistics to support his case. His podcast skyrocketed. His videos shattered view counts. But his events began attracting more than fans. Protests, threats, and growing resistance followed him city to city. Then came the final rupture with any semblance of moderation. January 6, 2021. Though Kirk wasn't physically present during the Capitol insurrection, his organization had funded buses to bring supporters to Washington. The day before, he tweeted, "Tomorrow is going to be a historic day for America." The tweet was later deleted, but the damage was done. For many, that post marked the moment Charlie Kirk crossed the Rubicon, from conservative activist to frontline figure in the populist right. From that point forward, he was no longer just a commentator. He became a threshold figure, walking the fine line between traditional conservatism and digital populism, between ideological mobilization and outright radicalization, between free speech and inflammatory rhetoric. He no longer spoke for himself. He spoke as a conduit for millions who felt unseen, unheard, erased. And because of that, he became to some not just a nuisance, but a threat. Kirk was now on a collision course, with liberal institutions, with academia, even with parts of the Republican old guard. Social platforms began flagging and moderating his content. Universities cancelled his speaking engagements. Media appearances were pulled. And yet, he grew. More followers, more donations, more power. This wasn't just the result of charisma. It was the reflection of a deeper reality. A country where the center no longer holds, where extremes no longer orbit moderation, but collide head-on. And in that landscape, Charlie Kirk became one of the most recognizable faces. By the end of 2021, he released The College Scam, a blistering critique of America's higher education system, which he called a multi-billion-dollar machine of ideological indoctrination. The book became a conservative bestseller. In interviews, he repeated a mantra that would define his later years. They don't just want to silence our ideas. They want to silence our existence. The air was heavy. the pressure mounting. The question was no longer if Charlie Kirk would cross a line, but when and at what cost. He had reached the peak of his influence, but with that height came exposure, criticism, cancellation, confrontation. The stage he had built with such precision was becoming dangerous ground. And the line between discourse and danger was growing harder to see. Between 2022 and 2025, Charlie Kirk reached the zenith of his public influence and faced the most intense trials of his life. On one side, he solidified his position as the most influential conservative communicator of his generation, a true architect of the Trump-aligned youth movement. On the other, he became an increasingly disruptive presence to traditional institutions, mainstream media, and even factions within the Republican Party itself. His public persona was no longer merely provocative. It had become a battlefield. The success of his podcast, The Charlie Kirk Show, was undeniable. With millions of daily listeners, it evolved from a commentary platform into an ideological engine, capable of shaping political consciousness among young conservatives on issues like civil liberties, national identity, immigration, faith, and gun rights. His guest list ranged from US senators to pastors, ex-military leaders, to social media influencers, all united by a common refrain: America is being hijacked. We must take it back. But the rhetoric began to shift. What once felt like political critique began to echo with apocalyptic urgency. Kirk spoke openly of a culture war, a conservative revolution, and the need for an ideological purge within academia. He wove Bible verses into crime statistics. He framed political struggle as a sacred mission. In doing so, he fused two potent forces, faith and identity. Turning Point USA by now was far more than a campus activism group. It was a sprawling media empire, hosting conferences, political trainings, live-streamed sermons, and festival-like spectacles. Events like America Fest drew thousands, blending evangelical worship aesthetics with hardline political messaging. The stages featured crosses, American flags, laser lighting. The message was clear. The American right had found its new sanctuary, and Charlie Kirk was its high priest. But no rise comes without resistance. As his influence expanded, so did the opposition. Boycotts, lawsuits, surveillance. Public universities began banning TPUSA events, citing safety concerns. Opposition groups mobilized protests in nearly every city he visited. Social platforms flagged his posts, some removed altogether, under claims of misinformation. Liberal media escalated their attacks, labeling him a youth radicalizer, a manipulator, and more viciously, Steve Bannon in a tailored suit. Kirk responded with fire. On his shows, he named and shamed institutions that he claimed persecute conservatives. He didn't say he was being censored for lies. He said he was being punished for truths they don't want to hear. He accused mainstream media of engineering panic to suppress dissent. And to his growing audience, the logic was airtight. If he was under attack, it meant he was over the target. This was the turning point, where Charlie Kirk, in the eyes of his followers, transcended the role of communicator. He became a symbol, a warrior against what they called progressive tyranny. His speeches became infused with martyrdom imagery, persecution narratives, and the language of holy war. He no longer just challenged institutions, he warned of eternal stakes, and the consequences followed. His events drew threats with increasing frequency. In 2023, a homemade explosive was defused minutes before a scheduled appearance in Portland. In 2024, one of his aides was physically assaulted outside a university in California. Kirk, unfazed, leaned in. "The left wants us afraid," he said, "but we will not leave the battlefield." By 2025, the tension was at a breaking point. America was fracturing along every seam. Institutional trust was collapsing. Disagreement was turning into danger. Every debate felt like a minefield. Every word, a risk. Charlie Kirk had become a figure both unbearable and untouchable. To some, he was a destabilizing force. To others, a necessary voice. And then, September, Utah Valley University. What was meant to be just another stop on his tour became something else entirely. Tragedy. The bullet that struck him wasn't just a physical act of violence. It was a blow to the idea that disagreement could still exist in the public square without turning into bloodshed. The culture war had crossed a final threshold. It had become literal. The silence that followed the gunshot was not empty. It was heavy, with questions. Who pulls the trigger in a country where words are treated like weapons? What happens when the contest of ideas loses the idea and keeps the fight? And the most unsettling question of all, did Charlie Kirk, with his incendiary rhetoric, foresee this ending, or did he help ignite it? In the final act, we'll examine not just the legacy left behind by this divisive figure, but what his rise and his silencing reveal about the America we now inhabit. A mirror we may not want to look into, but must. The shot fired in Utah didn't just silence Charlie Kirk's voice, it thundered across a political landscape already soaked in tension, fear, and distrust. And like every echo in times of rupture, it carried more than sound. It carried history, unheard warnings, unanswered screams. Kirk's death became a symbol, and like every symbol, it was claimed. Within hours, America's conservative right responded in unison. Politicians, pastors, influencers, and commentators hailed him as a martyr for free speech. His words resurfaced, multiplied, amplified, sound bites, speeches, sermon clips. Tens of thousands shared the hashtag Kirk lives. Charlie Kirk, the man, was gone. But Charlie Kirk, the cause, had just begun. Across the aisle, the reaction was quieter, more cautious. Even his fiercest critics paused in the face of violence. But questions began to surface, uncomfortable, unavoidable. Had Kirk crossed a line between rhetoric and responsibility? Was he merely a victim of a lone extremist? Or in part, an architect of the very atmosphere that consumed him? This is where legacy gets murky. It's not just about what he said. It's about how America responded to what he represented. In the wake of his death, Turning Point USA surged. Conferences swelled. Donations spiked. Volunteer numbers reached record highs. And like many charismatic figures lost in moments of national fracture, Kirk's absence was quickly filled with myth. He was invoked as one who paid the ultimate price for telling the truth. His image, framed by crosses, flags, and Constitution verses, began to populate digital church walls, homeschool curriculums, and online tributes. The martyr eclipsed the provocateur. But with every wave of tribute came deeper questions. What kind of political culture turns disagreement into danger? When did the university, the place once reserved for reflection and discourse, become a battleground? And how did language become weapon, literally? Charlie Kirk always claimed to be defending free speech, and in many ways he did. He championed forgotten rights, to dissent, to question, to be conservative in progressive spaces. But his methods, his delivery, his framing, helped fertilize a different kind of soil. one where empathy withered, where opponents weren't just wrong, but enemies, where us versus them stopped being a phrase and started being a strategy. To his critics, he legitimized hostility, normalized aggression, and stunted public discourse. To his followers, he simply spoke the truth others were too afraid to say. And perhaps that's the key to his impact. Charlie Kirk didn't create the fracture. He revealed it. He didn't invent resentment. He amplified it. His death doesn't mark the end of a movement. It marks the culmination of an era, one in which extremes replaced the center and speech became a battleground. Whether future textbooks will list him among political thinkers or incendiary agitators remains to be seen. But the ripple effects are already here. Universities are reassessing their security. Social platforms face renewed scrutiny over speech regulation. Churches and student groups continue to wrestle over how and whether to preserve his memory. In life, Charlie Kirk was a mirror. In death, he became a lens through which we're forced to see what we've become, not just in politics, but in how we talk, disagree, and coexist. And maybe, in the end, his greatest legacy is not in the words he spoke, but in the question his silence demands. Are we prepared to live in a society where free speech and responsibility coexist? Or are we still marching toward a place where every word might spark a flame? Because every time silence replaces a voice, the real question isn't just who spoke, but why someone thought they had to silence him. If you believe in stories told with depth, truth, and unflinching historical rigor, this is just the beginning. Our channel is dedicated to the lives that shaped our world, for better or worse, and whose legacies still echo through time. Explore the other biographies already available here, each crafted with the same care, precision, and narrative power as the one you've just witnessed. Subscribe. Turn on notifications. Share this video with those who care about politics, history, and the unseen forces shaping our reality. Your support helps us continue producing independent, thought-provoking content, free from shortcuts, full of meaning. And if you want to take this journey even further, visit our official store. There, you'll find rare, provocative, and powerful literary works, hand-picked historical editions that reveal the lives, ideas, and mysteries of humanity's most fascinating figures. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next story.